Today we're right in the middle of those 14 chapters I said could have been another book of the Bible, a book I would have called Prophets, because it's not about the kings, it's all about Elijah and Elisha. And today we're going to study 2 Kings 4 to 9, that's 6 chapters. The first 4.5 chapters of that is all about Elisha, nothing about the kings of Israel at all. So regretfully we must pass over that quickly. I say regretfully because this is such a rich passage spiritually that the pastor longs to linger. But let me encourage you to linger in your own private time. These are great chapters. For example, you could take 20 minutes in chapter 4 just answering the question, how many parallels can you find between Elisha and Jesus in character and deeds and words? I'll give you one for free. Their attitude to women. But just before we pass over these chapters, I can't resist picking out 2 diamonds. In chapter 4, we meet a Shunammite woman. We are never told her name. She's a wealthy woman, and she uses her money to help make Elisha's life a bit easier. And so Elisha comes to her and he says, "Is there anything I could do for you?" Now just put yourself in her place. This is one of the greatest miracle workers the world has ever seen. And he comes and says, "Is there anything I could do for you?" We used to fantasize about that as children, didn't we? You find a magic lamp and rub it, and out comes a genie and says, "Your wish is my command." And here this man is saying, "What can I do for you?" And she gives a most surprising answer. She says, "Nothing, thank you." And then she says this, "I dwell among my people." What I think she's saying is, I live among my people, I'm happy, I don't need any more. She's a woman with her priorities straight, and here's the first diamond. People are more important than money or things. But she does have something she needs. She hasn't got a child, and she's almost past the age of childbearing. But she doesn't ask for that because she hasn't got enough faith to ask for that. Now, one does hear a lot in the last 40 years about if you just had enough faith, you would get such and such. Well, here's diamond number 2. God sometimes gives us more than our faith can stretch to. And he tells her, in a year's time, you will be suckling a child. And it comes true. And so we do pass over these 4.5 chapters, and we come to chapter 8, verse 16. And suddenly we are back in the Kings. Now you remember last time that I showed you some of the fun we've had with names in this section of the Kings. It's very complicated. We've been looking at the life of the wonderful man of God, Jehoshaphat, and he has a son called Jehoram, and he has a son called Ahaziah. Meanwhile, on the throne of Israel, there's another Jehoram, sometimes called Joram. His predecessor was Ahaziah, and his successor will be Jehu. Now, to make life even more complicated, Jehu is the son of Jehoshaphat, but it's not the same Jehoshaphat as the king of Judah. So there it is, 2 Ahaziahs, 2 Jehorams, 2 Jehoshaphat's, all on opposite sides of the fence. I had a lot of fun on holiday trying to sort through all this so I could make my charts for you. So we now come to chapter 8, verse 16, and we come to Jehoram of Judah. He is the first king in Judah called evil. And it's a sad thing and puzzling. Why was he evil? He had such a godly father and grandfather. But sometimes these things happen and you can't say why. There is one possible reason, and that's who he married. It's a bit frightening that we get to make one of the biggest decisions of our lives when we're so young. He married a woman called Athaliah, and she was the daughter of Ahab and the dreadful Jezebel. You can hardly imagine she did anything good in his life. There was a young woman who went to the great preacher Charles Spurgeon and revealed to him that she was thinking of marrying an unbeliever. And when she saw his eyebrows rise, she said, "But I'm going to work very hard to convert him." Well, the big man put a chair next to his desk and asked her to stand on the table. Then he gave her his hand and said, "Now pull me up." And of course she couldn't. And then without the slightest difficulty, he pulled her down. And then he said to her, "Young lady, it's a lot easier to pull someone down than it is to pull someone up." Well, however it was, a combination of Athaliah and Jehoram led to great evil. Just to give you a measure of that evil, no sooner had Jehoshaphat died than Jehoram killed 6 of his own brothers. Such was the evil with which he started. Well, God allowed him to rule for 8 years, and then he afflicted him with a terrible disease of the bowel. And we are told that at the age of 40, he died in excruciating agony with his bowels hanging out. I won't elaborate beyond that. And so fell one tyrant. And then his son Ahaziah came to the throne. He also was evil, although he didn't have long to show it. One of the first things he did was travel north of the border to visit his uncle Jehoram, or Joram, who was still on the throne of Israel, recovering from some injuries. And there in Jezreel, these 2 wicked kings sat side by side in solemn conclave. Well, God had had enough of them. And so the prophet Elisha called one of the sons of the prophets, a young man. We don't know anything about him. We don't know his name. Here's another one of those heroes who walks in and out of the book of Kings. And he calls him and gives him a little vase of oil and says, "I want you to go and anoint Jehu, the commander of the king's army, as king over Israel." And then he gave him the strange warning. He said, "As soon as you've anointed him, get out the door and run for your life." Well, that wasn't bad advice, because to anoint someone king while someone else is king is actually an act of treason. And this young hero does exactly what he's told to do, and he goes and finds Jehu, anoints him with oil, and then runs out the door and flees for his life. Well, Jehu was not a man to let grass grow under his feet. He gathered the commanders of the army together, leapt into his chariot, and off he raced. Well, news reached the 2 kings that Jehu was on his way, and they were concerned what this might be about. So they sent a messenger. The messenger arrived at Jehu, who pulled his chariot to a stop, and said, "What do you want?" And the man said, "Do you come in peace?" And Jehu said, "What have you to do with peace? Fall in behind me." And there was something in the authority of Jehu that the man just obeyed and fell in behind him. I'm told that Nelson Mandela, as a young man, had some of that ability. He could just look you in the eye and command you. The whole incident is very reminiscent of when Napoleon came back from the island of Elba, and he came face to face with an army that had been sent to put him to death. But he stared them down, and when the soldiers saw those eyes, they were unable to shoot. Such, it seems, was the power of Jehu, because another messenger was sent, and exactly the same thing happened. And Jehu said, "What have you to do with peace? Fall in behind me." And the second messenger obeyed. Well, meanwhile, the 2 kings in Jezreel were getting very concerned, and they called up to the man on the battlements, "What can you see?" And the man picked up his binoculars and he said, "I see dust and I see chariots." And they said, "Whose chariot is it?" He said, "It is being ridden like the chariot of Jehu, for he rides furiously." I really love that. If he'd lived today, Jehu would have owned a Ferrari. He was a fast-driving man. I imagine him a little bit like Masala in Ben-Hur, driving his chariot furiously. And it would have been a very scary sight. Well, you can read the rest of the story yourself. Jehu deals very quickly with these 2 wicked kings. Suffice to say, he used 2 arrows to dispatch 2 kings. And so 3 tyrants are down. But Jehu's not prepared to leave it at that. Jezebel is still alive. And so he sets out to find her. When she hears he's coming, would you believe she puts on makeup? She thinks she can beguile and seduce him like she's done so many others. But this time she's misread her man. She looks out from an upstairs window and tries to seduce him, and he simply shouts orders to the eunuch standing by her, "Throw her down." And they throw her to the ground and she dies. And they don't collect her body for some hours, and when they do go to collect her, they discover that the prophecy has come true, that her body has been completely eaten by dogs, and all they can find left is a skull, 2 hands and 2 feet. All of this would make very good movie material as long as you gave it a decent age restriction for violence. And so a 4th tyrant falls. So what is the lesson of all this? Well, I think it is the words that John Wilkes Booth so misguidedly used about Abraham Lincoln just after he shot him. Sic Semper Tyrannis. Thus all tyrants. Gandhi once said,
"When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end they always fall. Think of it. Always."
So we come to the end of our 6 chapters, and what can we say? Well, we've seen 4 tyrants thrown down, Jezebel literally. And we've seen 1 anonymous woman lifted up. Death and life. We choose life.